it's of some significance that this document, the Port Huron Statement, reverberates today. For instance, in the Occupy Wall Street movement of last September, the first principle, one of the few things that they could agree on, was that participatory democracy was their transcendent principle, and that was a concept that was first announced in the Port Huron Statement, and it was transmitted by a philosophy professor that we knew in Ann Arbor, and before him, the American philosopher John Dewey. Well, I think students are facing issues that are much tougher than we faced. The unemployment picture is very tough. The global warming threat is even more unmanageable than the nuclear war threat that we faced in the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, there's more diversity. I think there's more familiarity with viewpoints than there was long ago. There's maybe some cynicism because the students have only seen things get worse. But I'm confident that if you're young and you've got your whole future ahead of you, you're not just going to sit around like a stone and wait. You're going to be called to action if somebody proposes a specific plan. Who's going to do it? If nobody does, I think students will, in their own way, in their own time, more or less rapidly rise to the occasion. They always have, and I don't see why not. Participatory democracy does not come from a theory. It comes from an experience of two things. One, an affected group of people like yourselves is really pained and feels morally insulted by some policy, and you have a concrete grievance. It could be, we want to vote. It could be that simple. And the second thing is that the representative institutions, or all the institutions, the banks you count on, the religious institutions, the universities, all the institutions have failed, in your judgment, from your feelings, to deliver on what you need to live a decent life, and you can't take it anymore. It comes a breaking point where you won't settle and you have to do something. At that point, no theory is necessary. We've seen it over and over, that people then rise up in small gatherings in their neighborhoods and assemblies. They begin to discuss, they come to a conclusion, this is what we want. They map out the decision-making territory that they have to navigate. They try to figure out pressure points. They usually go outside of the institutions that have failed them. They start with demonstrations, or they petition, or they have press conferences to try to shame some public official. That's all that is meant, really, by participatory democracy. It can be small scale. It can be the American Revolution, which would not have happened without participatory democracy. So I think sometimes when we look back, whether it's the 60s or the American Revolution, it's overwhelming, and you have this false idea that everyone was at the barricades, everybody was up in arms, everybody was in action, in motion, and it's not true. It's a tide. There's a high tide and a low tide, and there are waves, and sometimes small groups touch something off that is unexpected, and then you're in luck. You have a social movement for a time, and if you're strong enough, you'll get some of your grievances met. So I wouldn't be overshadowed by false pictures of the past. I do think that what you do in your life, like in Voltaire, cultivate your own garden, is very important. There's any number of Michigan environmental organizations that one might join. Reading, not just thinking that you have to study only what's required, but look for some great books, some great novels to stretch your mind, and look for friends who have common grievances. And and realize that if you take small actions, it's usually in the context of much bigger action.
One was certainly severe anger, outrage at the continued subjection of black Americans and the terror that prevailed in the Deep South as the civil rights movement began to demand its due. Anger at the extremities of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, anger at the complacency of most Americans and most of our exalted institutions, including the universities, which most of us came from. So on the one hand, outrage. Secondly, a kind of anguish about the lives that have been laid out for us. We've been promised comfort. We're affluent. We're as affluent as all get out. Getting more affluent all the time, and at the same time, a kind of hollowness, a kind of blankness of meaning, stagnation, and there was a strong feeling on the part of, I should add or underscore, relatively few people, that this was not a worthy existence that was being laid out for us, that there had to be more than the standard package of consumer goods, the house in the suburbs, the nuclear family, and so on. And then I would say also coexisting with the outrage was hope, was a kind of faith in the energy that could be distilled. I mean, I think one of the strong features of the New Left was something that maybe has become obvious since then, but it was kind of remarkable at the time. It's not only what we thought; it's that is what we thought we could do with what we thought. Action.
Participation.
Direct action.
In the society, yeah.
Direct action in overcoming injustice, changing the world by just picking up and changing it. So the remarkable thing about the sit-in movement that erupted in the South on February 1st, 1960, was it was not simply that there were some students who opposed segregation. A lot of people opposed segregation. They actually undertook to abolish it here and now. Okay, you go in you sit down at a lunch counter where you're banned, and you just, by that stroke of your action, you abolish segregation. You say, well, it's no more here. We're here.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The Port Huron Statement, drafted and written nearly 60 years ago, collectively by a small group of idealistic student activists centered at the University of Michigan in June of 1962, became a powerful manifesto of movement building, struggling for a more just society. It passionately proclaimed that a new left was needed to make that better world, brought the first wave of baby boomers into radical politics, helped develop a brilliant racial justice organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a storied campus organization, Students for a Democratic Society, which focused on the transcendent principle of participatory democracy. The New Left ascended dramatically, sprouted liberationist movements of all sorts, helped bring the Vietnam War to an end, captured the country's imagination, especially those under 30, with its positive energy and ethical idealism. It crashed spectacularly. It also captured a foreboding that read as it came from today's headlines, as if it came from today's headlines. Our work is guided by the sense that we may be the last generation in the experiment with living. Our three guests on the Radical Imagination today were major New Left leaders who have continued their lifetime dedication and activism to social causes. Al Haber was one of the original drafters of the Port Huron Statement and the first president of SDS. He's a cabinet maker working on the Megiddo Peace Project, is involved with the revival of SDS, and still resides in Ann Arbor. Robert Ross is a sociologist and activist known for his research on the global garment trade and globalization of capital and labor. He became a founder of the Ann Arbor chapter of SDS and a member of the drafting committee of the Port Huron Statement. Mark Rudd is a lifelong peace and social justice organizer and a student of organizing. Was a mathematics instructor at Central New Mexico Community College, a member and then president of the Columbia University chapter of SDS during the 1968 protests. Headlines cry out that the same issues the movement struggled with in the 60s and 70s still bedevil us today in even greater complexity. As we struggle to avoid that final eve of destruction, the need to reimagine what radical means and imagine what radicals would do in power is stronger today than at any time in the history of the old or new left. So thank you all for being here. And we're really blessed and honored to have some of the founders and leaders, and actually, as Gary Dorian puts it in his American Democratic Socialism book, he called you the ringleaders. The ringleaders were Hayden, Haber, former Michigan undergraduate Sharon Jeffrey, Bob Ross, Michigan graduate student Dick Platts, and a couple others. So we have the leaders, the founders, the ringleaders, and thank you very, very much for being here and discussing what SDS was, what it's about, what it meant, and where its legacy is. The theme, as I was talking before the show to Al and Mark, was collectively come about. Through a series of emails, usually I ponder the title of the show, what to call it, and so on. We did it collectively. Imagine what being a radical is, and what would radicals do if they were in power? So can we begin by talking about that, by looking at the birthing process that led to SDS? What was the history of it? What were the different factions that were playing at the time? Without getting into the weeds here, we can spend 6 shows on that, but give our audience a little bit of a background, a history of how you perceive the New Left and your contribution in it as it began in the early 60s. We can begin with whoever. Al, you want to start? Start us off?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to do that because I don't know that the old history is as much as the current situation.
Okay.
But when I became a student in 1954, I was introduced into the freedom movement and created a little group called Political Issues Club. And in 1959, instead of the usual 4 or 5 people that came to the meeting, there were about 15 or 20. And Bob Ross was one of them, and it was a new spirit that sort of developed, and people were ready to be done with the apathy of the 50s and get on to some more creative engagement. And I want to just put a metaphor into the conversation there. When the old system, like the caterpillar, starts to eat up everything and consume everything around it and grind it up all into its many legs to crawl over everything, and then out of itself it spins its cocoon, and inside itself there are some in the cells that break free and they form a little ooze inside the cocoon. The old caterpillar sees that ooze and it sends out its rays of immune protection, and the ooze feels itself under attack from its old self, and it sends out its little defenses and begins to organize itself. and eventually it becomes the butterfly. And what is that ooze called in there in the old remnant of the old system? Well, the scientists call it the imaginal cells. And I think that's a way to see where we were in 1959 and 60 and 61 and 62 and where we are now. We are in the ooze of the decaying old system, and we are the imaginal cells of the new system seeking to become and organizing ourselves into the butterfly of the new world. And I think that is a useful metaphor because we don't really know yet who we are. We have not formulated this butterfly. We have not adequately described the new system of caring and sharing and helping and healing and cooperation. We still define ourselves in terms of rejection of the old system of capitalism and imperialism and despotism and criminality, and basically a system of war and destruction. So we're at that point of leaving the old and not yet having a view of what is the new. And I think that's where we are right now. And in some way, that's where we have been. We had a spirit of optimism because the Eisenhower period was indeed ending. And while we weren't exactly partisans of John Kennedy, we saw him as a voice of a new generation that did have peace in mind, not just to win the war, but to end the war. And when he was murdered, that was the coup d'etat by which the war system took control of the Pentagon and the government, and have had that control and have maintained the war ever since, as they are in their pressing of NATO and their break Russia viewpoint, and the poor the Ukrainians are paying the price now, as did the Afghans and the Yemenis and all the other subject of the war system.
No, that's a terrific metaphor. Just as you were talking, my mentor, Richard Clower, who I studied with, here is a picture of him protesting. The rich are eating everything. So there you go. Same idea. Mark, Bob, you want to add your comments to that?
Go ahead, Mark.
Actually, I think, Bob, I'd like to hear what you have to say. I'm 3 generations. I'm 2 generations away from you guys in terms of the history of SDS, and my relationship to SDS is more of a gravedigger than a founder. So, which I can explain.
I think that's remarkably self-reflective and modest. But
remember,
Todd
Gitlin had a lot to say about that.
Yes.
So I'd like to hear you, Bob.
I'll take it up, Mark. I have come at this question that you posed, Jim, from a different angle than that of my mentor, Al. I recall, Al didn't mention it, that among the brilliant things he did before SDS was really in motion was he planned for, I think it was sometime early spring in 1960, but he made the plans in 1959. That's very important. To have a conference in Ann Arbor on human rights in the North. So, mind you, this was before the February 1st, 1960 sit-ins that Al planned this conference. Mm-hmm. By the time the conference came round, many of us, myself and my future co-chair of the SDS chapter, Sharon Jeffrey, were both became involved in the picketing of Woodworth and Kresge. Al, we went to the conference that Al created, and got recruited when my life was never the same. But the point here's the meta point here. Al was looking over the horizon. The civil rights movement, that is its direct action phase that began in 1960, did not had not yet exploded on the horizon, but Al was looking over the horizon at human rights in the North as well. So may I please, with that notion in mind, look not over the horizon, but at the horizon. A lot of left-wing people who think of themselves as radical bemoan the rise of the radical right and the Trump cult. And many, I am one of them, who call it fascist or fascistic. I believe that to be true. If it is true, and if their strength is, as we know it is, that is the dominant force in many state legislatures, growing all the time, and an obdurate veto power force in the National Congress. If all of this is true, if they really are fascistic, then the primary task for radicals and small d Democrats and big D Democrats and small r Republicans of all stripe is to prevent the taking of power of a fascistic party. That seems to me to be the primary strategic task of those who would defend, advance, and prosper under a democracy. That view, of course, lends one to a different tactical view of what to do. First of all, it scripts itself as high attention to electoral politics, right down to the details of which congressional districts can be won, which are aspirational, and so on. This leads to a politics that's different from the politics of the 60s. It requires the primacy of strategy over feeling, of emotion. It requires making decisions about compromises that may be unpleasant, but required to keep crazy fascists out of power. So that's where my thinking is. I don't find this a happy place to be, A, because of the gravity of the threat, and B, because that it has not this kind of urging of a strategic view of compromise has not been where I've been for most of my life. Nevertheless, I'm haunted by the 1933, 34, 35 experience of people like us in Germany, where the inability of left-wing forces prevented their actual majority from coalescing. So that's quite enough for an opening.
No, very, very interesting. Mark, please, do you have?
Bob,
thinking?
I just want to thank you, Bob, for moving us ahead 60 years, because that is the question of what is to be done.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky for decades has been saying that the left, that the social democratic left, let's call it roughly the progressives, but the social democratic left represents about 60% of the population, and he's been saying this consistently. This is 60% of the population wants universal health care, universal free higher education, etc.
National health insurance.
What was that?
National health insurance and so on. Yes.
Yeah, but that is not the electorate, and it's far from it. To talk about public opinion and the majority of the population, we have a problem of people not participating in politics. Well, I want to go back to the moment. Let's say 1975, when the war in Vietnam ended, and the anti-war movement more or less collapsed, although it morphed into a number of different other social and political movements. So the women's movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and the gay movement, and on and on and on, including crazy dead ends like Marxist Leninist revolutionary parties. Meanwhile, the right coalesced way long ago, back in 64. They coalesced around the need for power, and they worked for power for many, many years. So eventually in 81, they attained power, at least the presidency, with Reagan, and it grew over the years, and their voting majority grew because they worked at it. They created an electoral base in the Christian evangelical movement, a very, very reliable base. So the question then is, why did we not seek power? And what is the problem with the left, that we seem to shun power? We don't want it. Is it because we're basically anarchists and we don't want to be told what to do, and we don't want to tell other people what to do? I mean, I don't want to dominate the discussion, but it's a question I have. Why did the right, the Goldwater right, the John Birch right, all of these elements coalesce for power, worked for power, and got it starting 60 some years ago? And we, on the other hand, have never worked towards power.
Well, yeah, before perhaps Al, you'll respond, I want to just throw in briefly the issue that, Bob, you were sort of not decrying, but less emphasis on feelings. But what about the moral argument? I mean, again, wasn't SDS also about a revolution of values? Do you not see that also being expressed in Reverend William Barber's Poor People's Campaign? Fusion politics, bringing together these disparate people who have been separated and divided by the power elite, if you will. I want to bring Todd's memory and comments in on this as well. And I was, for example, Todd, it quotes Hayden, who quoted Gandhi about nonviolence and redeeming the enemy. You have to love everyone. Redeeming the enemy is as important as changing society. It's a revolution of values. This is what is Barber talking about this. Radical love that Cornell West talks about. And Gitlin recalled, to me, this was Hayden at his most eloquent. The new left as its most stirring. Is that part of the component that was missing perhaps in the new left, in the left, among radicals? Revolutionary radical love? Or seeing issues also within the moral prism?
That's not accurate, Jim.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
In the process of doing the Port Huron statement and of writing the early sections, okay, Tom made a point of distinguishing the approach that we were taking from what he thought of, and I think it was more or less an accurate take, of the so-called old left, namely the versions of Marxism that had been inherited from the Stalin era, in which, in fact, were value propositions were put in the language and the syntax of scientific inevitability. And in fact, some orthodox Marxist-Leninists in that time would argue that Marxism is not about values, it's a science, it's about a prediction, and we're on the right side of history.
Right.
This Tom, who was raised in a Catholic milieu, rejected this. And he persuaded us that that a more values-based language was morally superior and politically appropriate. So it's not accurate to say that this idea of values or morals-based view of politics and political action was missing.
Okay. No, I didn't mean to imply it. I was trying to partly respond to what Mark was saying, and then Al was also bringing this up. The notion of radical love, that again Barber so eloquently is espousing here. The necessity to add that dimension to the sort of electoral realignment that we hope to effect. That's what I was saying.
In the actual discussion of the Port Huron statement from the draft that Tom made, he put values at the end of it, and the meeting itself said one of the main bones, as distinct from the widgets of stylistic change, was to put values in the front. That was a decision of the group that in some sense corrected Tom's beginning with analysis of the problems and values at the end. But I do want to respond to Mark's view of 1975 that we fragmented in 100 ways, which maybe is true. But my sense of the time, maybe I was seeking to look over the horizon that wasn't there. I had proposed that that was actually the time when we should move to take power. That the movements had never been stronger in every front. The anti-war, which had been victorious, the civil rights movement strong, the women's movement, the gay movement, the Native American rights movement, the Chicano movement, the environmental movement. Anywhere you look and everywhere you look, the movement was alive and well, and that was the time for us to break from the old party structure to make a political union that was value-based at looking for a new system that would generate among ourselves from all the different struggles, what were our common points, put forth a seed of programming, allow us to develop it, and put a new program before America as a different system. Let the people who were to lead it be the last choice, and the first was to develop the union of consensus around we needed system change, we needed a new way, and the old way was defunct and needed a change. And in some way, in every precinct in America, people were active in knowing that in one frame or another. And the left or ourselves were not able to rally to that. Tom was one who chose, instead of a national unity and larger vision, to challenge for the Democratic primary for the Senate in California. And at the other extreme of was the yippies, who said the whole system is stupid. It's a piggy system and they should run Pegasus for president. And satire was the only way to deal with American politics. I think that was a critical time when we had the potential for gathering, because everyone knew in so many different dimensions that the system was broken and there was potential for a larger unity around values and around the actual solidarity that people felt in their living struggles in so many different ways. I think that is a potentiality now again. And while I recognize what Bob is saying, that we need to deal with the actual electoral system, it may be that the way to deal with that is to define the imperative for system change, that both of these parties are so corrupted by their complicity with the war system, with the Pentagon, with the values of $700 and some billion directed to the murder and the structures of murder that predominate in the society and are playing themselves out in the Ukraine now, that we need a different system that is not characterized by full spectrum domination and by imposition, by hierarchy, by ultimately impunity, unaccountability, and fundamentally violence, to a different system that is characterized by mutual aid, caring, sharing, helping, healing. And I would call that the peace system, as distinguished from the war system we are in now. And when Paul Potter asked in 1965 in Vietnam, what we must name the system, and we never adequately did. We talked about how economics is run, But I think now is a time when people realize in so many dimensions the system is broken. We could rename that system as a system of war and domination, and we need another system of full spectrum cooperation. And that message might indeed reverberate even to across the line of proto fascism that feel themselves threatened in every dimension, to see that we really need at more the family level of the caring and sharing and helping and healing, the non-monetized relationships of love and mutual aid and solidarity that people live on in their normal lives, but that our organized institutions do not really reflect. So I just put that in while I recognize that we are in a very tense political moment, and the protos of fascism, they are alive and well, and they are expressing themselves even in the Ukraine that they were seeking to in some way protect from the Russian domination. But when the Ukrainians can, when on the Ukrainian TV, they can be saying that the only way to deal with the Russians is to kill the babies because the babies will grow up to be anyhow. Quoted Adolf Eichmann as a challenge, as a patriot. You know, the fascism is alive and well, but we need another system that is more human based. And I call it the peace system as distinct from the war system. Maybe there's another vocabulary that is better, but I haven't heard it. And so that's my bit of radical imagination for the moment. And how do we actually make a peace in the world by bringing people to the table to put down the guns and talk with one another like human beings and able to share food and look eye to eye.
I think we're all searching for that way of doing that. By the way, just in passing, I've co-founded an institute that is established now at Union Theological Seminary, and the institute is called Institute for the Prevention of Violence, bringing about the Blessed Community, with psychiatrist James Gilligan and Bandy Lee. So we are all in favor of what you're talking about. I think we all are. But what form might it take? And I know, Bob, you have to leave in a little bit, so I want to make sure that you get the time in there to respond.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your graciousness, but I I want to hear from Mark. Mark has written a tremendous reflection on some of the errors he and colleagues made, and has been thinking very seriously about what we can learn from our past moving forward. And I'm really interested in what you have to say, Mark.
Okay,
Bob, I don't. First of all, I would like to. Okay, I really would like to know what you think, but
I'm going to say that.
okay. Let me put it. Let me just say. We're in the realm of radical imagination.
Yes.
So let me say two things. One is, I think the New Left foundered on the fantasy of violent revolution, and I and my comrades in the Weather Underground were at least as responsible for this horrible turn. We fantasized that U.S. imperialism would fall from without and from within, and we were the third generation of SDS, and there was a certain inevitability about it, I know, but there were other paths that should have been taken, namely more on-campus organizing to spread the awareness of what the system is. People, 10 years later, the United States, after the end of the war in Vietnam, the U.S. Attacked Central America, and people were confused because they didn't understand that this was a part of the system of imperialism. So The road not taken was more organizing, but the question of violence is if you're confronting a violent system, we've got to have better strategy. And nonviolence, the whole technology of nonviolence, including civil disobedience of various sorts, and including non-cooperation, all the tactics that have been codified by a scholar like Gene Sharp and Erica Chenoweth. These nonviolent resistance or civil resistance is powerful. And we made the mistake, many people on the left, for example, the resistance against the draft were nonviolent. But SDS, or rather elements of SDS, made this fatal turn. And so anything that happens in the future, we've got to adopt nonviolent strategy. And a good source of it is a website called Waging Nonviolence that I highly recommend. Now, second, the question of power has got to be confronted. Even today, Bob, it was absolutely on point when he said we have to fight fascism. Well, fascism is in political power now. So it makes no sense to fight fascism by not voting. That's crazy. That's exactly what the fascists want us to do. I had 5,000 followers on my stupid Facebook page, and I ended it because I found myself wasting my time against people who hated the Democratic Party more than they hated the fascists.
Yes.
On
Okay.
the left. And I
So-
said, this is a total waste of time. I had to end this. So,
brother, let me
all right,
check.
now I have one more thing to say, and that's it. The far right gave us a model. The model was take over the party closest to you and seize power electorally. Why don't we just unite, take over the Democratic Party, and seize power for social democracy? It's so simple. I'm done.
So, Mark, let me comment in a way that looks not over the horizon, but at it at 22 and 24.
Okay.
And address one small dimension of your advocacy. Of course, I am for, quotes, nonviolence. But let me imagine a county in Michigan in 2024 where the local militia has surrounded the courthouse and wants to prevent the counting of the mail-in ballots.
Right.
Now, I imagine this for 2020, and I wrote to people who were in a position to act on my off-the-wall idea. I said, are UAW locals prepared to surround the courthouse and defend the vote counters physically?
Yeah, with our bodies.
They weren't. That's not what they ended up doing. They ended up hiring more lawyers than you can fit in a courthouse, and they won all the fights. However, in principle, these are occurrences that can and have happened. The bad guys surrounded Cobo Hall, big convention center in Detroit, while the counting was going on, and the counters inside were harassed and scared. I don't know what the Detroit police were doing about that, but I'm a little concerned when we emphasize nonviolence that the other guys have militias and guns, and we're a bunch of pacifists, and we could get eaten up.
Yeah, no, it's true. That's what would happen in Charlottesville.
Well, just to add one thing to that, Bob, it's likely that the police are on the side of the fascists.
Yes, significant fractions of them, yes.
So the predominant of violence is on the fascist side. We have to develop some kind of a judo to use that against them.
I like the idea.
Okay, all right. Al, do you want to comment on your comrade's remarks, and perhaps also bring in Todd Gitlin and some of the things that he might have,
and Tom Hayden, who
Tom Hayden
discovered the Democratic Party very before a lot of us did.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know how we deal with protecting the vote count, except that should be and is increasingly a concern that the local voting officials are really central political figures now. And that politics becomes much more local as to what really is the democratic voice of the people. I think, though, that the increasing the voting participation by having a clearer voice as to what really is the elections about.
Right.
And I think the collaboration, Democrat and Republican, toward the system of global violence is a problem that keeps everybody away.
So would you, Al, would you be for voter registration?
Yeah, of course.
You okay? So you're aligned with what Mark is saying too, right?
I think the automatic voter registration when you get your driver's license. Okay. It's in some of the national legislation. It's in the Michigan legislation. That all that should be universal suffrage and empowerment is an essential part of any sense of a functioning democracy.
But you're still the peace option that you're talking about. My feeling is you're reluctant to say that it can be incorporated within the Democratic Party, as Mark.
No, I think that this needs to be a debate in the Democratic Party whether we are continuing our military budget, our defense of NATO, our encircling China, our view of ourselves in the world as the dominant factor rather than a greater humility and recognition of the darker peoples of the world. Right. Everybody is most concerned with Ukraine, but occasionally there are voices. How come there wasn't any concern about Yemen, about Ethiopia, about Palestine, about Sudan? And they're all kind of darker people. They're hard to see these days because in the dark background.
Right. What do you all think about AOC? I mean, what do you see her as someone that you can live with, that is on the track of bringing about the sort of political power, if you will, that you think might make significant changes? Mark?
Yeah, I think so. She's
okay.
She worked in a bar. She's basically a working class person.
There you go. Okay.
And is talking truth. The same with Rashid Tlaib in the district in Michigan.
Okay.
I support Huwaida Aroof, who's also in a Republican district trying to run in Michigan, and there's a mainstream Democrat running against her. But I think people who have some roots in the movement are getting more and more prominence and are the new Democrats. And maybe that is the language we need to become a new Democrat, distinct from the old.
I wish we had more time. Mark, you just want to, we've got like seconds to go, but final wrap up. You agree also with AFC or go ahead?
Can we have a redo?
On what? On life? On the whole show?
No, on the radical imagination. And let's get some young people in on it too.
You're a young guy. Okay. All right. I would love that. Would you all love that? Absolutely. Okay.
Talk to me offline, and we can. I'll give you the names of some people to invite.
We'll do that. Thank you so much. Listen, we go on. We will get the young. Thank you so much again. We're over time. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
We love you all, and we will continue this. Thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. We'll talk to you again, and we'll see you again next week.